I'm very happy to welcome everybody on Rain or Shine today, and I have the great pleasure to welcome Erika Koss today, who has many robes at her row. I don't know if that's a saying in English, but that means she can do a lot of things, and she will tell us a lot about her background already and what took her to coffee and to the specific topics that we are going to discuss today. So welcome, Erika. I'm very happy to have you here, of course.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me, and it's nice to see you.
Yes, it's been a few days. To tell the truth, Erika has been my teacher for a few days.
I wasn't going to say that.
Yes, but it's also like sometimes I like to say also like how I know the people who are the guests at Rain or Shine, and without it I would not have known about you. And also I have to say that Regine is the person who put us in touch. So without the sustainability course of the Specialty Coffee Association, I wouldn't have had the opportunity to meet you and to talk to you and to you know, get to know the whole amount of knowledge that you share already with the coffee community, and it's only the beginning, I suppose, and you have a lot of depth to bring to the coffee community, and I think we can discuss. We have some time to discuss about it today. So let's start. Can you maybe
begin.
Let's begin, of course. Yes. Just a little note also for the Rain or Shine users. I put a file where you can find a few links also from articles that Erika wrote and published already on some of the themes that we are going to discuss. So don't hesitate to go on Rain or Shine and get the links over there. Can you introduce yourself? You'll be probably much better than me to do that, and probably you can tell us a little bit about your research and what took you to coffee.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I began in coffee, like many people, I think, as a barista. That was in the middle of the 1990s in San Diego. I was born and raised in Los Angeles, and my parents still live there. And then later went down to San Diego, where I was working on my master's degree at San Diego State in English literature. And it was, it's one of those things where at the moment you don't really know how important these two different paths you have. That, it's like a train track in a way, and you have one on one side, and it wasn't till later that I really put it together, that the fact that I was studying English literature with a focus especially on African literature and Shakespeare and poetry in general, and then working in this coffee shop, which I absolutely loved. I had just the best 4 years, working as a barista and a supervisor. And in my case at that time, our coffee shop was very much like a family. And it was everything to me to have those people that we worked with. Some of my best friends at that time, were there. And so it was just this really fantastic part of my life to be a barista and then be working on my master's degree and reading. And of course, we would always talk about the books we were reading, because I would be reading, whatever I had for school, but almost everybody else was in college somewhere as well. So we would get in these debates. It was really great. Another part of this story is I had actually been in Kenya and Uganda the year before, in 1994. And maybe I should have said that first, except that summer and that trip actually didn't have anything to do with coffee specifically. It had to do with music and teaching. And so then when I came back from, I left LA, went to Kenya, went to Uganda. I was there for 4 months, actually here, because that's where I am now. And then went back to LA, and then, later became a barista. And it was a really, it's just another part of my whole coffee story about, how I was selling the coffee beans, the Kenya coffee beans, to all these people in San Diego. And nobody knew anything about beans at that time. Like even consumers who, they loved coffee and they were so particular about, how their coffee is made. People, it just wasn't talked about like it is now. We and Emmanuel, the third wave or the fourth wave of coffee, I'm not sure, but it was a different mindset. So that was always my favorite part is selling, the coffee beans, especially from Kenya. And then if I just like fast forward for many years, I was always trying to get back to Kenya, where I live now, and I'm just so happy even to still be here, because that wasn't the original plan, to still be here in June of 2020.
Yeah, you got stuck, right? That's what you mean.
I got stuck in a good way. It's not really stuck, because I'm so happy about it. Yeah, it was not really the original plan. But I think everybody, for us this whole year, nothing's happening in the original plans, right? Mm-hmm. So, but how I'm here now is as a research associate through the University of Nairobi. And yes, I'm working on my research focused on women in coffee in Kenya in particular, but in East Africa in general. And, that's a much longer story. I don't know if you want me to get into that now, how I got from English literature to coffee and specifically, international development in an academic way.
Well, it is intriguing, but I don't know if we have the time. But
yeah, it's a long story.
That would be an interesting story for sure. But you managed though to find a great link between literature and coffee. Can you tell us a bit more about this?
Sure. I think where I can begin, at least part of that story, is so I was, after I stopped being a barista in San Diego, what I was doing then was teaching literature at San Diego universities, and I was teaching writing and teaching poetry. And I would almost always have students who, they were freshmen or sophomores or sometimes transfer students. They would come into my writing class or my literature class in particular, because I would teach poetry in my writing class as well. And they would say things like, "I hate poetry." And I would say, actually, no, you don't. Like, that's just not true. Because poetry is music and everybody loves music. And even with poetry, I really just have this belief that sometimes it's, you haven't met the right teacher, or sometimes maybe you had a good teacher, but maybe the poetry that was taught was not really, to your liking. And so, but, that was a very common thing for people to be, well, I hate poetry. And I think sometimes even, with coffee and beverages, there's that link as well, right? Where people think, I don't like this drink. I don't like this method, right? I have to have my cream and my sugar, this way all the time. And then, if we say, well, wait a minute, what if you try it brewed with a Chemex? And if you try it, just for the first time, it's okay. Just try it without the milk and the sugar and see what you think. And then, and you've seen this, right? Like, people light up and they're like, wow, I've never had coffee like this, right? So, it's one of the many links that's there for me in terms of like how I approach coffee and how I approach teaching in general. It's all like a continuum. But then the other thing that links maybe a little bit more specifically to our conversation today is, so I had been teaching, especially, human rights and politics through literature for many years. And then, long story, I ended up to learn about the International Coffee Agreement and the relationship that the United Nations had with coffee politically and globally. And that really got me interested more in terms of how coffee was linking with East Africa and the history of it. And I wasn't finding things written that I wanted to know about. I would be looking for different articles, thinking, of course somebody has written about this, or of course there's a book about this, right? Well, there isn't. right? So that was what led me to start to go to coffee conferences. I think my first one was in 2015. And that was the conference, it was the expo when the specialty flavor wheel was being revised. And I walked into that conference, you know, with that past as a barista, but there was no specialty flavor wheel in the cafe where I worked.
Mm.
So it was a brand new thing to me at that time. And of course, it's so beautiful. I think they had a draft, you know, at that conference, and there were many talks about the flavor wheel and why it was important. And I just kept thinking, Emmanuel, the whole time, this is poetry. This whole flavor wheel is poetry. And
How
since,
so?
and
Can you explain that?
because, yeah, because of the words, right? You know, so if we taste strawberry, what strawberry are we talking about? Are we talking about the California strawberries near where I grew up? Or are we talking about, I don't know if you have strawberries in France that
Yeah, we
are
do.
grown throughout France. Yeah.
Mm.
So I'm sure those taste different.
Mm.
If I taste Kenya strawberries, it's different, right?
Mm.
So we have this word on this beautiful, you know, very, I think very important, you know, tool of the flavor wheel. But actually at the heart of it, it's about words. And, you know, when you talk about a strawberry, what do you mean? And
Mhm.
when I talk about a strawberry, what do I mean? And how does that fall on our palate, right? And what is the, you know, what is the brightness or what is the body of that, you know?
So that's
So
why
to me, that
we
was,
oh sorry. So that's why we need a
no,
lexicon next to it, right? Like we
exactly.
need a dictionary for poetry or literature, I suppose.
Yeah. And that for me was it was a big moment. And actually even thinking about our conversation today, it led me to think I don't think I've really talked about this very much. So it's really nice to talk about it with you because it was a big moment where I thought, wait a minute. So if this whole industry has a whole lexicon about our senses and, you know, actually defining what all of these things mean, so that globally we can have this conversation. You know, it's poetry. That's like exactly the same thing if I'm talking about a sonnet or a villanelle or whatever.
Yeah, except that in that case, it's difficult to make it a universal tool or language because you know some of these flavors in the lexicon are defined by products that you can only find in some parts of the world but not others. So how can we? In the end, we don't. It's difficult to have the same sensory language because we don't have the same
Yeah.
reference everywhere. But yeah, but that's the I see the link here for sure. Poetry is words then. So I'm not, I wouldn't say, I would never say I hate poetry, but I would probably say I don't know about poetry, and so then I cannot enjoy it, and I haven't enjoyed it. When I see people enjoy it so much, I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about. I suppose for coffee is the same also. There are haters and there are people who say like, I don't know what good coffee is because I don't know, I just drink my everyday coffee. So I was wondering if you can maybe tell me a poem and then maybe I would be like, whoa, by it. And I would put the light.
Yes. Actually, I remembered I have the poem in a different spot here. So let me change my let me change something. While I'm pulling this up, I wanted to also add, you know, that when we're talking about poetry, right? The medium is words, but what's really going on is music, right? So, you know, that's part of, you know, and this is a long, this could be our entire conversation if we wanted it to be. I know we have many things to talk about, but, you know, about how that works out, you know, that link between words and poetry.
Hmm.
But I think it's, you know, these links of, you know, like we're using strawberry as an example with the sensory lexicon or the wheel, you know, then we say, okay, well, what do you mean by strawberry? Like, what are you tasting or what am I tasting, right? And I personally, I don't know what you think, but I think, you know, there is something objective, right? There is something that's actually a strawberry, right?
Mm-hmm.
But some people may not have developed the language or the experience to describe strawberry.
Right.
So maybe even they've tasted it and they didn't know that that word went with that, you know, aroma or taste or whatever.
Yeah.
And poetry is like that too, you know, because it's just so much about what you've been exposed to.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we're also talking a lot today about different words. And so, you know, that was a setup that I wanted to share in terms of, you know, like when we talk about words or we talk about ideas, you know, for us to be on the same page, right?
Right.
And I think in coffee, it's very easy. People will talk all the time about taste or about varietals, but we don't always talk so much about these bigger, you know, more political, social coffee words.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, I'm trying to find this poem.
Just as you do that anyway, I just, because
Mm-hmm.
we do, when we taste coffee and we train on tasting different coffees, we say that we build up our vocabulary of descriptors anyway. So there's really like, it's a bank of words that we need to develop as we experience it, as you said, and as we retain these words in front of a sensory attribute. And it's just by reading books you will build up your vocabulary, but it's just the same with coffee. As you drink and as you talk about it as well, and you use these words and you listen to these words, you build up your coffee vocabulary.
I love that. You said build up a bank of words.
Mm.
Did I hear that right? Yeah.
Yes,
I love that.
it's a better bank
Okay.
than usual.
Yeah. I like that bank. That's good. Okay, I have the poem if this is a good time.
Please.
It's very, very long, so I'm not going to read all of it. I'm going to just read the beginning. I'm going to read the middle where coffee is mentioned, and I'll read the end. So the poem is called Blood on the Wheel, and it's by a poet named Juan Felipe Herrera, and he was the California Poet Laureate for quite some time. He's a pretty well-known poet in the poetry world, and he has a background. I believe he has some to migrant workers in California. And so some of that comes through this poem a little bit. So he has this little epigraph at the beginning of the poem, and it says, Ezekiel saw the wheel way up in the middle of the air, which is an old gospel song. And he mentions this. So when we think about blood on the wheel, which is the theme of the whole poem, we can think about when coffee comes up here. So here's the poem, Blood on the Wheel by Juan Felipe Herrera. Blood on the night soil, man en route to the country prison. Blood on the sullen chair, the one that holds you with its pleasure. Blood inside the courts, the beauty watch, the eye of the guard. Blood on the slope of names and tattoos hidden. Blood on the virgin behind the veils. Blood in the moon angel's gold oracle hair. What blood is this? Is this the blood of the worker rat? Is this the blood of the clone governor the city made? Blood on the couch, made for viewing automobiles and face cream. Blood on the pin, this one going through you without any pain. And so now here's where I'm going to skip, because he goes through many, many lines about all these different ways that blood is used. And then he goes to, okay. It's blood time, Sir Terminator says. It's blood time, Sir Simpson winks. It's blood time, Sir McVeigh weighs. Her nuclear blood soaked, will it dry? His whitish blood ring smoke, will it foam? My groin blood leather roped, will it marry? My wife's peasant blood spooked, will it ride again? Blood in the tin, in the coffee bean, in the maquila oración. Blood in the language, in the wise text of the market sausage. Blood in the border web, the people quality shed in the bilingual yard. And then I'm skipping here to the end. Blood at the age of 17, blood at the age of 1, dumped in a gray house bus. Could this be yours? Could this item belong to you? Could this ticket be what you ordered? Could it? Blood on the wheel, blood on the reel, bronze, dead gold, and diamond deep. Blood, be fast.
There's a lot in there.
Yeah.
There's
So
a
that's
lot.
it's a specific kind of poem in the way that, he's repeating blood with so many images over and over and over again. It's not something that I think we're always so familiar with in terms of that style of poetry, where it takes one image of something that we all know about blood, right? But then he's making us as the poet think about blood in a completely different way. And the line here with the coffee, I'll just read that one line again. It's blood in the tin, in the coffee bean, in the maquila orason. And this idea for us to ponder, is that always true? Is there always blood in the coffee tin? And whose blood is there, at whose expense?
So it's pretty obvious though, no?
Well, I think to you and me, but maybe not to everyone, right?
True.
Because I still think a lot of coffee drinkers in particular in North America and Europe don't always think about all of the human hands who make their coffee and all beverages possible.
True. Yeah, it's deep. Regine says in the chat, it's intense. It is, and it's true.
Yes.
There is the rhythm, takes you again and again and again, and then there are a few sentences that have a completely different rhythm as well, and they sort of get out of there. And
yeah,
it was deep. And why is coffee included in that poem?
Well, I do know a lot of poets, but he's not a poet that I know. It's definitely the question I would love to ask him, if I ever get the chance to meet him. But I think, the image works really well because he's layering all these different moments of life where there's blood, where blood is shed, where blood is taken. Even he mentions the Virgin Mary. We think about, there's blood in, especially Catholic, religion, which is what he is mentioning so many times here. And then we think, well, okay, so to be explicit, right, whose blood is in the tin and on the coffee bean? It's the labor of people, specifically for him, it's in Latin America, but also for Africa and Asia as well, in terms of, the labor and even the sorrow, right?
Yeah,
as
was
very
going to
difficult
say,
work.
Is it only the labor, but also maybe, just the history of it?
Absolutely. Yeah. So the history of colonialism and, the way that, that coffee came to most of the coffee producing countries, it was specifically through colonialism, whether that was a colonial leader or administrator, or whether that was a missionary. There are many, many cases where coffee came to a new region or a new territory. I say new, not because the land was new, but new for coffee. So because coffee is not native to most places where coffee is now. And it was very much an intentional, structured regime of colonialism to have coffee be a cash crop that would not benefit people who were farming and laboring for it, but that it would benefit them as colonial leaders, even missionaries, even for settlers who might have lived, say, in Kenya. The benefit of that coffee, profit was going to them. It wasn't going to the people who were working so hard in the fields. So going back to this poem, he never uses the word colonialism in the entire poem ever, but we can see in all these different images, and the coffee is one of them, that, this idea of whose blood was shed in many cases with colonialism, it was a very, very violent story about how the land was taken from one group of people, and then the native or indigenous peoples were then forced to uproot their crops that would be used for their food crops, and then they were forced in many cases to plant coffee. Mm-hmm. And of course, coffee has no nutritional value, as a tree. So, essentially people were giving up, the word wouldn't have been used, food security at that time, but that's the concept, right? Like they're giving up their food security, forced to do this thing that they don't want to do. And yet they have to, otherwise they will be, the subject of even more violence than they already were.
If I were If I were the
No, I was just going to say,
yeah.
Sorry, we have like a pause here. Go ahead.
No. Just if I were the devil's advocate, I would say that it created opportunities. That's usually what people who try to defend colonialism or that past history would say. Well, actually, we created a lot of opportunities for the countries. So how do you respond to this?
That's a big answer.
True.
My short answer to that is that is justification for the brutal. Sorry, my battery just did a funny thing there. Okay, you can still hear me, right?
Yeah.
My answer to that, as a short answer, is that's justification for the brutal violence and selfishness that happened under colonialism. So yeah, of course, like any system, people were justifying, why they were doing what they were doing for different reasons. They would say we're bringing civilization to this place. But the hypocrisy is very clear when you especially read, the history and the stories, and even here when I talk to people, because colonialism wasn't that long ago, actually. So, there's people still alive who remember and have the stories, or even if they're not alive, they have the stories of their grandfathers and grandmothers. And so when you hear the story, it's like, okay, well, civilization at what cost? Because they used brutal methods to achieve civilization. It's that hypocrisy is something that, of course, many people have pointed out. That's not a new, idea I have there. But this is part of the history of coffee, and it's something that when I mentioned before that when I got more into coffee from an academic point of view, it was one of the things that I was looking around to see, okay, where's the story of, the specific nuanced stories, especially for Africa, when it comes to colonialism in coffee, and it's really hard to find them. So hopefully that's part of what, my research and my writing will be part of, contributing toward.
In your experience, do you think colonialism as a word is taboo in the coffee world, either in consumer countries, but also at the production sites in some ways? Do we talk about it?
That's a great question. If I think back to that first conference that I mentioned to you before in 2015, I never heard the word colonialism ever. And so even though I had been studying post-colonial, literature and criticism from a literary point of view for, at that point, it was like 15 years. I had been reading about everything post-colonialism, right? And yet I come to coffee, I'm like, wait a minute, why aren't we talking about this? Because this is actually the history, but no one is really, at least publicly, they were not, talking about it. And even still, I think it's something that what I hear people will say maybe one or two sentences, quite often, they'll just kind of skim over it. And I think some of that is just because those specific stories really aren't always told, and they're hard to find. Yeah. And a lot of the colonial a lot of the colonial countries actually burned their archives. They, even before a country achieved independence, a lot of those records and those documents were literally burned away. So, this idea of, trying to get oral histories, or, be more specific about not just like, oh, coffee's colonial history, but like a more specific, because coffee's colonial history in Kenya is a different history than the colonial history in Haiti, or, in Indonesia. So, that is something that is a much bigger research agenda for sure.
I'm wondering because, so being French, we are huge, and we have of course a heavy history of colonialism. But I always find that I don't know about today, but I don't think it's better. But I always found that the history that we were taught at school about colonialism was rather light, and we figure out by reading afterwards that some truth were being hidden, of course, because I think that's what we can summarize it. A lot of things are hidden. And so I was wondering also from your experience, because you grew up in the States, is it something that you learn at school, and how difficult would it be to get an interest, and because so the States as such are not colonial, don't really have a history of colonialism, but we can, through the history of the United States, they are like, what is the link, the historical link between the States and colonialism, and what came after?
Okay, so that's another big topic. You're asking me such good questions that are really, any one of these could be the whole hour together. The US actually does have a colonial history. It's not specifically a coffee history, because of, in terms of, the 13 colonies and leaving the British, and, and those stories in terms of what was done to Native peoples. It was just as gruesome and just as brutal, and just as much stealing land and extracting crops and extracting profit, right? So that story for sure is there for the US. But when we talk about, coffee and colonialism, that is a different story, right? Because now if we talk about Hawaii, though, as the 50th state of the United States, actually Hawaii has its own very, very, very tragic colonial history, which again is, and I don't want to just deflect, all of these answers, but it's just, like these stories and these histories have a lot of players and a lot of complexity. And it's not something that, I want to like say in a glib way, because those stories, they need to be told, and I want them to be told. And I hope that, that's something that will begin to change as we go through the 21st century, because it's very hard to find them. Like if you even just do a Google search on Hawaii coffee colonialism, you won't see very much. You'll maybe see, a couple blog articles, or things that are very short, but in terms of like scholarly research, or people doing interviews and that sort of thing, to my knowledge, that's not being done quite as much throughout the world. But yeah, you can find it. One good resource is a book by Paige West. I know you know this book, the one where she is focused on Papua New Guinea. And she has a really great chapter where, not the whole chapter is talking about colonialism in Papua New Guinea, but she's telling that history. So you can find it if you want to. But yes, I did learn about this growing up in California in particular, because California, we have our own history as a state. So. But for you, did you, growing up in France, did you ever think about the link between colonialism and all of the different products and the different crops? Or was that just something that you learned about later?
Well, we had a certain link, but I would say it's romanticized, as it's been. And so I wouldn't be able to tell you like at what age I actually figured out that like what the consequences were in details. I suppose much older, especially when I started to travel, because it's really when you see with your own eyes, when you see how people look at you also, and
Yeah.
because you wonder why they look at you that way, and of course there's a history, and um, there's a lot of weight. And as you were saying, in Kenya, some people are still alive that knew colonialism, but it's true for other countries still. So especially, I remember spending some time in, although it's very different, and they have a very different country history. But when I was in Ethiopia, the old people in some villages, not all, I wouldn't say it's a general thing, but some of them really had a really hard look on me. So it's you feel the weight of whatever happened to them before. So
Yeah.
so you get to question a lot when you travel, for sure. I don't know. Well, maybe that happened to you when you were in Kenya at first.
Yeah, in 1994, it was very different because, travel wasn't quite the same then. The roads were, okay, some of the roads are still very bad, but they didn't really exist back then. So, and so for that, and that was a trip. So I think it's different when, it's a trip versus, when you're coming to a place to live, so. But yeah, it's certainly something in terms of, you asked if it's taboo. Still you will very easily find people who will say, no, colonialism is not with us at all anymore, in terms of the legacy, right? Officially, colonialism is over, right? But there are these legacies, right, that we can still see the impact. But you will find people who will say, no, it's not there. We're independent now. They want to move on, right? And so,
are they truly independent? And
what?
especially, are they truly independent? And probably not with the way colonialism was before, but with a new sort of with capitalism, basically. Like, can we make a link between the two? Is it too easy to make that link, or is it really there?
No, I'm glad you made the link, and it's absolutely there. In fact, even when you read, even historical texts about colonialism, capitalism is there, right? So, this is the thing, is that, colonialism was a system, right? Capitalism was and is a system, and so, of course, the question you're asking about this link between, how is capitalism also perpetuating some of these inequities? Yeah, it's absolutely there. And, I've been reading a lot, especially lately, especially in this year, where, a lot of people argue that the aid, all of the financial support that especially the US and Canada and Europe give to Latin America and Africa and Asia. There's many economists even who would argue that all of that aid is not helping these countries to become truly independent, right? So there's political incidents that happened at various times for, depending on the country, but yet how much dependence is still there in terms of, the global north essentially supporting the livelihoods, again, in theory, because it doesn't always get to the people, right? So yeah, that's a big international debate, and coffee is part of that, because there are many non-governmental organizations who are working on coffee projects. And, this is where I know we were going to talk a little bit about resilience today. That is a big way that I see resilience. Again, depending on how you see it, it's either happening or not happening, right? Because when I talk to coffee farmers, I find them to be some of the most resilient people I've ever met in the whole world. And yet, you'll see, NGOs coming in to the phrase will be to build resilience. And, when I look at that, and sometimes I wonder, it's like, well, were they asked? Was this community asked? What did they want? What would building resilience look like for them? Or was this just an outside NGO coming in and then saying, this is what we're doing? Now there's some good examples of organizations and projects and whatnot, but generally it's still all part of a global system that is actually based on colonialism.
It's just the heritage, but in a more economic system. Where does the international coffee agreement stand within these two systems? Like, is it a consequence of one or the other, or not really?
Yeah, so the International Coffee Agreement has a long history also. And a quick story about that is that in 1962, it was the first time when different leaders from coffee producing countries and leaders from coffee consuming countries came together. They had never come together in person, specifically to try to come to an agreement around the challenges with price. So, this is another, big story here when we talk about, the price crisis that we've been in with coffee for, I think it's going on almost 2 years now. Well, that price crisis, there's been many different versions of that in the past. It's just, flaring up in this particular way right now. But in the past, that was one of the reasons why the United Nations brought together all of these leaders. It wasn't just coffee. There were other commodity crops that had their own conferences as well. And so coffee was one of this set of trade conferences that were being organized at the UN headquarters in New York. So the goal of the conference was for the leaders to try to achieve an agreement on a quota system. And actually they did. They came to an agreement, and it was a big achievement. Not perfect for sure, but some of those other trade conferences did not come to agreements and couldn't balance things a little bit. So there was a period of time where that agreement was very important, especially for the newer coffee exporting countries, because Brazil at the time then and still is the largest producer of Arabica coffee. And so there were many countries that actually couldn't even compete on the global market in terms of export. So that agreement allowed some countries to try to, get in the game, that phrase, where like they could, try to compete. And then it collapsed in 1989, both Brazil and the United States. So Brazil is the largest coffee producer, and the US, again, then and now, as the biggest, buyer of green coffee. The two countries ended up, for various reasons, they couldn't keep the agreement going. And so because they both essentially dropped out for political debates, then the whole agreement collapsed in 1989. So I think it is part of, all of these challenges that we're talking about in terms of, when we talk about coffee, who benefits and who is receiving the profit and who is making the decisions. And those kinds of challenges are still with us today.
How come
Yeah,
we don't
it's a
seem
big
to find a
challenge.
solution? If it's still a challenge today after all this that history and tries, I suppose, legitimate tries, how come we don't find a
Hmm.
solution yet?
Hmm. Well, the okay, my answer to that in part will be to say that the countries who are benefiting from coffee, they don't want to give up that benefit, right? And even within coffee producing countries, there are certain people who are benefiting and certain people who are not. So it's even a little bit more complex now, you know, in a post-colonial world. Some would say we're in neo-colonialism, depends on who you ask, but for sure we're in capitalism. And you know, the way that these especially racist policies, you know, they will not end under capitalism. So there, you know, there has to be, you know, from the leadership and the structures, you know, that will be always the thing that I'm looking at the most, as you know, as a political scientist and as a literary with a literary background, right? Is to look at the political structures both internationally and nationally, and then to see how does this actually affect people, right? So that's why even for my research, I'm you know, conducting interviews, and I'm talking to people, and I'm trying, mostly when I talk to people, that I'm not talking like today. Like I'm listening to them tell me, you know, and hearing their stories. And you know, it's definitely, the policies are not working in many places.
Hmm.
So I think it's going to have to be, you know, a lot of political will and a lot of structural change for real, we talk about sustainable change to happen, you know. And all of these efforts, you know, in terms of education and NGOs, it's for sure there's some really great organizations doing great work, but if they're not changing the structures of inequality and inequity, then I think, unfortunately, you and I could be talking about the same conversation in 30 years.
Can you define these two words that you just used, inequality and inequity? How different are they? Because we have a thing with words, so can we use them?
Yes,
Well,
yes, we could talk about that. So these are two big concepts that I am passionate about trying to help all of us in coffee think about the distinction between equality and equity. Because what happens a lot of times is these two words are just used interchangeably, and actually they're not the same thing. So if we think about equality, you know, equality is something where, you know, especially we can talk about measurement. So like, even if we think about equality in math, right? We have that equal sign. And, you know, you think about, you know, in this mathematical equation, you know, do these things, you know, balance each other? Do they equal each other, right? um, and um, and that's okay. So that's for math, but what about for people, right? So equality, you know, when we talk about it in terms of people, a lot of times people are saying something like, you know, they want, you know, equality between men and women, or they want equality between different countries or different races, or you know, sexualities or whatever, right? But the challenge when we think about just equality is that actually we're not all equal, right? Because we, different people are born in different places. Even if you're born in the same city, you have different parents, different educational opportunities. You come into a different kind of household, right? Like, and you just trace that through the whole life of a person, right? And it's not equal.
hmm.
So if equality is actually, you know, the goal for people, then okay, I mean, but I think it's very limited,
Hmm.
right? Because we're not all starting out from the same point in life. So equity, though, is stronger, because equity has to do with justice. Equity has to do with what is fair, right? So equity actually would take into account, okay, so here's one person who never had the opportunity to go to school because maybe they had to work on the farm, their whole childhood, well, that person needs a boost in order to, try to have some level of fairness with somebody else who maybe in the same community was able to go to school, and I'm just using that as one very basic example, right? But equity, if we want to talk about a world that is equitable, that is more robust, because that has to do with justice, and that has to do with what is actually fair. What do you think? Is this, I know you and I have talked about this a little bit in terms of equality and equity.
Yes. Can we say also that, again, is that a shortcut that is not acceptable, but can we say it's positive discrimination, equity?
Some people, yeah, that can be said. Some people have used that phrase. Yeah, it's a tricky phrase because that has different connotations, right? To even say it that way.
Of course,
but yeah.
But it's equitable and fair. It's of course obviously words that we hear a lot in coffee, and especially coming from organization, certification organization, and we think of them at first as legitimate and doing good things, but also we hear a lot of criticism about it. So what is fair in the end? How do we define fair? What is the threshold of being fair or not? Because a lot of critics would say, well, they publicize themselves as fair, but are they really fair? So when do we become really fair and equitable?
Yeah. It's really complicated because part of it is fair. I think this is what you're saying, is it's the question of fair based on what standard, right? Because, even the obvious one in coffee is fair trade, right? In terms of this whole network of certification. Well, of course that has its own history of how and why they started and what they're trying to do, but is, $1.40, US per pound with the social premium on top, like, is that actually fair? Is it fair enough? Right? Is it? So, I mean, these are questions that people in these organizations are asking these questions, and they're thinking about it, yeah, it's when we, and I know I showed you that picture, Emmanuel, about where people are trying to reach for, I think that image was designed as it's apple trees, but I like to think of it as coffee trees, that people are trying to reach, and the question is, how high do you have to reach to try to grasp the coffee cherry, and if equality is the goal, then everybody's at the same level, and so then there will still be people who cannot reach the coffee cherry in that image, right? But if we talk about equity, then it's a question of what kinds of assistance, or what kinds of mechanisms need to take place for everyone to be able to reach the coffee cherry. And so, yes, that's why it's my preferred word is, to say, I want gender equity. I think also, when we talk about cultural differences, there's people around the world who equality is actually not really their goal. Their goal, they don't care about being equal, right? But they, actually equal, but they want an equitable life and equitable opportunity. So I think there's the potential for that word to take into consider cultural differences in ways that are also helpful.
Yeah, I like the equal opportunities because it opens up a lot of things. You know, everybody should have equal opportunities. Well, and because do we in equal opportunities do we get the sense of equity? Because in that sense we everybody has the same potential of reaching out to whatever they're trying to reach.
Yeah.
But yeah.
And by the way, they're both French words anyway. So, you know, there's that in terms of the etymology, you know, they both equality and equity were originally French words, and then, you know, have their whole story of how they come into English.
Thanks for the link.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Does that come from the revolution, maybe?
Before
That?
So, I mean, yeah, the revolution, the French Revolution, it definitely popularized the motto, right? Of liberty. Well, you should say it in
Fraternity.
French. I'm not going to say it in French, but
Eh,
the, you know, liberty, equality, and fraternity,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but no, both words are older than that.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sorry because I just did a little on the side for the equity and equality, but you were talking about the UN, and also I know that you maybe the UN also do you think the UN still have a role in coffee? And also, I
Mm-hmm.
know that you spent some time in the archive. Was it for your research? Where did you spend time there, and what is there to find there about coffee? I know I did spend some time also in the library of the ICO, International Coffee Organization in London, and I thought it was an amazing time that I had there. And by the way, whoever wants to go there, I think you can just write to them and get an appointment, and you can go into the library. And is it the same for you, UN? How do you go there, and why did you go there?
Oh, okay. So, well, I want to hear about the ICO library because I haven't been there yet, but it's on my list for sure.
You should.
Yeah. Were you there for some research for yourself, or just because you wanted to see the library?
Just because just because I wanted to see, and I spent more time than I thought I would, because it's not big, but I've never seen that many books about coffee in one place.
Mm-hmm.
And you can spend weeks if you want there.
Yeah.
So there's unlimited information to read about different all the producing countries, the history, the legal stuff, the treaties, all the work that the ICO has been doing, of course, and there are people there who can help you and direct you as well. So yeah, I encourage everybody to do it.
I just saw in the chat, Regine just said that that it's an amazing place.
Yeah,
Yeah.
she's
So
been there.
Regine, I didn't know you'd been there also. So now I want to hear that story from you as well. That's great. Yeah, my plan actually was to get there at some point in 2020, but of course that plan is no more.
Shattered.
So maybe I'll do that for a future project. Yeah, but the UN, the UN archives in New York. I don't know what is in Geneva or not in terms of the coffee archives, because I haven't been to the Geneva library. But for the New York headquarters, they have a really great library there, and it was really exciting for me because it was the first time that I had ever. It was early in this whole research project that I'm doing now. And it was the first time where, I write to the librarian and I meet with the librarian, right? And I get there and I'm so excited. And what I was looking for is I wanted to read all of the minutes and all of the notes from the coffee conferences that I was talking about before in 1962. Because remember I said I was like looking for all of these articles and books that I couldn't find. So this was one of them where I thought, somebody has surely written on this conference, and why did this conference matter? What happened? Who was there? Which countries were there? and I couldn't find people people would mention it, but there wasn't anything as specific as I wanted to read. And so I thought, well, I better just go there. And so I had the chance to be there. I was there almost a week, and every day, reading all of the minutes and all of the archives from the conference. And yeah, it was very dusty and very, very yellowy, old paper. It was very exciting. So,
yeah, I bet.
yeah. So that's, I hope, at some point in the sooner than later future, I'll be able to write something about that and share with all of you.
Great.
Yeah.
Because you are a writer, by the way. You write and you publish.
Yes.
Okay. So, by the way,
I need to publish more.
You need to publish more, yeah. Okay, because we all want to read you anyway.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Regine. Yes, you do. I have a few things coming out later this year.
Okay.
Yeah, I've been working on those, and yeah, thank you for the encouragement.
Yes, we can wait. Maybe we can. Should we do that music break, and then we
yes,
can.
That sounds great.
We can talk a little bit about. So you can either stop your video or just mute your sound, or you can dance to the music or whatever. If you want to see the lyrics, if you can dance, yes, Regine. If you want to read the lyrics, you can go on Rain or Shine, and I also put it on a file to get there. So you have the French lyrics because the song is in French, but you also have I put the translation there, and it's about coffee. It's from a band that's called Milk, Coffee and Sugar, and the title of the song is Café Zèbre. So enjoy. Oh, I have to do something first because it won't work if I don't do that.
Milk, coffee, sugar. Milk, coffee, sugar. Une saison tropicale, la branche d'un caféier, cordon ombilical, je suis graine de café. Cueilli, séché, décortiqué, torréfié par un exploitant équitablement exploité, puis exporté car j'ai l'arôme d'un kawa brun cannelle, à même de rehausser le goût d'un paquet camel. Une graine de café que tu mets aux enchères, passant de sa terre au marché à terre, Arabica, Robusta, Wall Street, City, Londres, spécule sur ma valeur, toi le trader du monde. Et comme je suis vénère que tu me vendes et me décaféine, je vais te nervurer tes yeux, café cocaïne. Le soleil garde ses rayons sur la pointe de mon crayon, mais laissez-moi raconter l'histoire de Milk, Coffee puis Sugar. Laissez-moi vous conter l'histoire, Coffee, Sugar, Milk, Coffee et Sugar. C'est la mode des Starbucks, des chaînes, des franchises. Laissez-moi donc être une graine de café affranchie. La vie de rêve, un 5, un bistrot, une soirée slam, un café philo lyophilisé, soluble et en litres, café combattant venu remporter le filtre, dissous dosette instantané, expresso, je te brûle la langue et du coup, je suis très saut. Apprécier, en croire mon délire onirique, déguster, savourer comme je l'ai toujours voulu. Et dans une architecture d'ordre rhétorique, je serai votre café d'ordre moulu. Le soleil garde ses rayons sur la pointe de mon crayon, mais laissez-moi raconter l'histoire de Milk, Coffee puis Sugar. Laissez-moi vous conter l'histoire, Coffee, Sugar, Milk, Coffee et Sugar.
Brick et clope, la petite pause coffee shop, c'est dans une cafette que j'ai rencontré mes meilleurs potes. Ils racontaient des salades, en faisaient des céréales, brisaient les régimes des filles, de sérénade. Son cousin Milk l'appelait ainsi, je comprenais pas son succès, il était laid lui aussi, pourtant il actait dans toutes les tasses. Milk et crème et les moins belles, pour pas de sugar se glace. Je me suis mélangé à eux, une idée en tête, un café au lait sucré, c'était le titre et la recette. La gourmandise avait enfin sa boisson, un café albinos que tu écoutes à foison.
Le soleil garde ses rayons sur la pointe de mon crayon, mais laissez-moi raconter l'histoire de milk, coffee et puis sugar. Laissez-moi vous conter l'histoire. Coffee, sugar, milk, coffee et sugar. De l'eau dans le vin, du lait dans un café nègre, c'est blanc, noir, zèbre. De l'eau dans le vin, du lait dans un café nègre, c'est blanc, noir, zèbre. De l'eau dans le vin, du lait dans un café nègre, c'est blanc, noir, zèbre. De l'eau dans le vin, du lait dans un café nègre, c'est blanc, noir, zèbre.
Here we go. I hope you enjoyed.
I love that. That was great. How did you, is that a popular song? Or how did you find that song?
Oh, well, it's I asked a friend of mine who what were her favorite coffee songs, because I do have also like a small playlist of coffee songs where the where coffee is the theme, and she sent me, in her list was that song, and she reminded me that we actually discovered it together, but I just completely forgot about it, and I just love it. It's just perfect. And if you actually read the lyrics or the translation, you'll notice that they actually talk about some of the things we are talking about, that is colonialism and sustainability, fairness. And not only that, but also like the life of a coffee place, cafe or coffee shop, and whatever happens in a coffee shop. So the whole life around coffee, really, from the bean to the cup. There's the whole story there. It's cool. It's very cool.
I loved it. It's a great song. I think, since this is a virtual coffee shop, then music should be there, because so many of us, I'm really, missing being able to spend time in coffee shops. And part is because of the music, but also partly just to meet with friends and just sit there and enjoy coffee, right?
With the atmosphere, of course, yes. Yeah. So there's no coffee shop open in Nairobi?
There's a couple who just opened in the last couple weeks.
Okay.
Yeah, but before, maybe 1 or 2 weeks ago, it was only takeaway.
Okay.
And even that, not all the coffee shops would have takeaway. So just a few of them. Yeah.
What is the resilience of coffee shops in Nairobi? No, I'm just joking. You were actually talking about resilience before, and we mentioned also the word sustainability, which obviously were two words that were in my mind 24 hours a day when I was in your class, because we think a lot about these two words and the definition of them and how they are being used, and whether be it in the coffee community, but also in research, in published research and case studies and so on. And we saw with the class and with you that many times these words may not be used well, even by professionals. So can you explain that, and also like explain these words, but also can you explain why we don't use well these words?
Yes. You can still hear me okay, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Great. Yeah, I'd be happy to. So we can start with sustainability. So sustainability is such a big word that has been used in so many different ways and in so many different concepts. within coffee and out of coffee. But part of what we do in my foundation class is to begin with the history of when did this word begin as a global concept. And actually, we have an answer to that. It happened in 1987 with a report that was published, Our Common Future. And there is actually a definition of sustainability in that report that is one that is used very popularly, you know, again, not just in coffee. Coffee had nothing to do with that report, actually. But the report was talking about environmental degradation and poverty. And it was one of the first times when that link between what goes on our earth and, you know, and it's linked to poverty. And I just think about that sometimes because 1987 is not that long ago, right? And yet, you know, in the last, 30 years, there's been so much focus on sustainability and, you know, what it means and what to do or what not to do, right? And so in my class, yes, I start with, let's talk about that definition from that report. But then, you know, we can also think about the different aspects of sustainability as not only being environmental, but also social and economic. And they go together, the three of them. There's an analogy, the three-legged stool of sustainability, which a lot of people use just to think about the fact that, you know, okay, if maybe you have a cafe and maybe you're going to focus on environmental sustainability, maybe that means you have to have a trade-off and not think so much about social sustainability, you know, because it's hard to do everything all at once, right? But at least to have that awareness that if you're saying perhaps as a cafe, you know, we're going to focus on environmental sustainability right now, but then maybe in the future we'll focus more on social sustainability or vice versa. But what I've learned from teaching this class for a year and a half now is that the environmental sustainability is still very much the focus, even in the coffee world. You know, that is, you know, people think about water or carbon or soil or, you know, recycling and composting, things like that, right? It's all important. But of course, you know, what I'm wanting people to think more about are people and, you know, all of the people behind coffee and the social and economic challenges there. The word itself, sustainability, is a verb, which actually means to bear, to hold up. And it actually is a word in its etymological root that asks us to think about our hands. Like, who are we defending? Who are we helping? Who are we holding, right? So of course with coffee, it's a really powerful image because so many human hands are involved in the entire coffee supply chain, including ours, right? When we enjoy a drink of coffee.
Of course. And we can't, when we talk about sustainability, of course, we need to think about all these different people along the chain, because we for obvious reasons, we should think more about the producers, but also we can think about baristas, and can we say that they are really in a sustainable position? Is it a sustainable job? Do they earn enough money to actually have a life and to build the life as they want to, or is it not a sustainable position? But of course, the focus is on producers.
Yeah, I believe that we will not have a sustainable coffee chain until every human along the entire value stream is able to to really live a sustainable life. And I would say also for their families as well, not just for the individual, because I think it's important for all of us to remember that, the coffee income, when it's coming to a family, right, it's usually not just supporting that one individual. It's usually supporting, many other people in some cases. So it does go back to this question that we were talking about before about, fairness and equity and what that looks like, because, the coffee income, it remains very, very important as a cash crop still.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about the definition of sustainability, especially after going through the course? Are you thinking about it mostly in terms of baristas and competitions and things like that?
Well, I am a biologist at first. I then became a coffee professional, but so my background and my education at university would, I would learn about ecological, environmental sustainability. So for me, I had a focus on environmental sustainability for sure. And then when I started coffee, I studied as a barista. So let me just say that I didn't live a sustainable life when I was a barista. And I see that Regine says the baristas are the coffee pickers of the coffee shops. So yeah, in some ways it's true. It's a funny.
Wait, what did she say? I can't see the chat.
Baristas are the coffee pickers of the coffee shops.
Oh, yeah. It's a good point in terms of, we think about exploitation, right? And which moments of the chain, are people working so hard at a very, professional, labor intensive level, and yet the salary or even the hours, right? From cherry pickers to baristas, those are very demanding hours, even in terms of transport. How long does it take to get to your job? If you're a barista living outside a city and then going inside. And then of course, for the time that we're in right now with, COVID-19, for sure, a lot of baristas are suffering because of all the cafe closures. There are not that many that I know of, at least in Nairobi, who kept their barista staff the whole time.
Yeah.
There are a couple. But for many people, it was a really hard time because they're depending on that barista salary to live their life, and it wasn't there. So, but I'm like you. I mean, I started as a barista, so I'm very
aware.
I'm very mindful. Yeah, and also because if I had a livable salary, then maybe I would even still be a barista because I loved that job. So, but it wasn't possible to sustain.
Exactly, and as you said, like once you have a family, it's not doable. You have to think something else because it's not possible. But yeah, I would say again, it's for me the turning point was first time I went into a producing country, and when you see the real life, even if it's just a few days, but you see the conditions of the people working there, especially the pickers, but not only, of course, but that's when you realize, the difference, of course, but the difficulties that it entails for the people who actually probably don't, for most of them, they don't live next to the plantation, so they have to leave home for a few weeks, a few months, whatever, and they have a very small pay, and hopefully the season goes well for them, of course, because there's this uncertainty always for them. So that we don't have as a barista, for example, because when you have a contract, and you're still safe, at least if you have social laws that protect you. But it's not necessarily the case in the producing countries, of course, and that uncertainty is making the resilience for these people a bit more complicated, I suppose. If I'm using the right words, Prof.
Yes. Well, resilience is, resilience is similar to sustainability in that they're both very big words and big concepts. But, you know, one thing, I'm happy we're talking about this now because, you know, in like our former conversation before the song about, you know, equality and equity, and I was sharing my view that, you know, these are not the same thing, right? So it's a similar concept with sustainability and resilience. They're not the same thing. And yet so many times these concepts are used interchangeably. And I think that it's something that I really, you know, especially in the classes that I teach, I know my students are, you know, leaving with this deeper thinking about, you know, the way we use words matters. And, you know, if we are talking about sustainability, okay, no problem. Then let's use the word precisely. Let's define it. Let's make sure that all of the partners involved in whatever you're doing, does everybody have, you know, a definition that has been agreed upon in some way? Or, you know, is it useful to that context of whatever it could be, right? And the same thing is with resilience, you know, but I think resilience even has a longer history, a longer story. And, you know, the word there, it's coming from the Latin verb salire, which means to jump. And so then you put the re in front of the salire in English, and then what happens, it's to bounce back, right? So literally it's like, we think of almost like a rubber band, right? It's this ability that can you stretch and then return to that original, you know, for using the rubber band analogy, you know, return to the same shape as the rubber band. Okay, well, when we think about resilience though with coffee, whatever part of the chain we're talking about, actually in many cases, I don't think that bouncing back is the best solution, you know, because especially if we're talking about some kind of climate disaster where maybe things were, you know, forever changed in that community, or even in a cafe, you know, whatever it could be, right? Whatever disaster happened. And I would say for sure, COVID-19 is a disaster, right? In terms of a global pandemic. So, you know, is our goal in resilience to bounce back and just go back to this former life that, you know, some of us enjoyed and others of us didn't enjoy? Or is the goal in resilience something else? And I think that's where, you know, again, like the way we define words, especially if, you know, we are, you know, part of teaching or, you know, solving problems globally, then it's really important to be precise with our words because it's actually affecting other people. So in the article I shared with you, you know, that's where I came to the idea that actually I would prefer to say, let's bounce forward with resilience. So instead of, you know, bouncing back and going back to some sort of idea that we all had before, which for many people was never good, can we imagine something else? Can we create a new reality where there would really be equity and real resilience for everyone?
Can you give us a success story about resilience and bouncing forward in coffee?
I think there are many examples of people who, you know, in all different parts of the coffee chain, when there is some kind of struggle, you know, whether it's a climate disaster or the global pandemic that we're in right now, where, you know, that disaster happens or is happening. And then, you know, you have to reframe, how are you doing your business, right? Because you cannot go on just business as usual necessarily in that situation. And so, you know, one thing that I'm seeing from my friends in Canada and the US a little bit is the idea that, you know, because everybody was working at home so much, you know, and actually people were able to work at home, right? And so I think some companies are starting to look at that and say, well, maybe we didn't always need everybody to come in every day, you know, and then, you know, that could be a good change, even in terms of, you know, climate emissions and all of the various problems, you know, that ensue, you know, in terms of transport, right? Because that's where so much of carbon emissions come is from global transport, right? Even with travel, right? We're all rethinking this. So, you know, that's not necessarily just a coffee example, but, you know, there's certainly, you know, many times where, you know, if you can think about whatever that challenge was that you faced, and then think, okay, what are some things that now I actually don't want to go back to, right? I want to use that challenge as a way to transform and make things better for yourself or your family. So that's just in general terms how I would think of bouncing forward.
Nice. Do you should we have a final word about what would you like to talk about more? Words about sensory. We haven't talked about competitions as well, but in some ways they are linked because we're talking about quality and how we evaluate coffee. Do you think it's important for you or for coffee in general? Competitions and also like the way we evaluate quality in coffee.
Oh, well, I think, you know, the competitions are a really wonderful way to potentially celebrate different parts of the world and different, you know, the achievement of, you know, say a barista or a latte artist or, you know, how to brew. You know, you and I have talked a lot about, you know, the possibility of the stories that are told in these competitions, you know, for them to just the question about, like, are there ways that we can think about as an industry for the coffee producer and other people along the value chain to benefit from being focused upon in that competition, for example, so that while, you know, of course, you and I have already been saying, you know, how much, you know, being a barista was and is important in our lives, you know, but the only way the barista in that competition can compete is through the coffee that he or she chooses, right? And so, yeah, I would love to be in a situation globally where more people benefit from the storytelling that happens in those competitions.
Do you think
what do you think? Because what do you think? Because you've competed. I've been a judge. I know you've been a judge as well. But what do you think should happen in terms of the storytelling?
Well, I suppose I would love to have a competition where the coffee producer is actually does have an active role. I mean, not saying that he doesn't have an active role in general, because, you know, he produces the coffee and the quality of the coffee is there thanks to her or him. But it would be great to have a concept, a competition where the producer is actually also in front of the audience, in front of the judges. Because sometimes we do have, there are some competitions organized for what is the best coffee, you know, but sort of the same way that the coffee producer sends the coffee, and then, okay, there might be like a winner coffee, but the producer is nowhere to be seen. And we don't, unless there is a picture of her or him somewhere, we don't know who this person is really. And it would be great to have a sort of a competition where the coffee producer would also present his coffee and talk about it. I don't know how possible it is, and probably many producers don't even picture themselves in that position, but why not, after all? And why not try to find a type of competition, a concept where we don't leave it only for the most the producers that already have most of the chances, you know, they have the capital, they have maybe the education, I don't know, they have the origin, just in general, everything is sort of facilitated for them. But Yeah, it would be very, very interesting to find a concept where we can integrate, you know, and again have, I suppose, equity in the chances of winning, because
Mm-hmm.
you know, of course, if you're well ahead with your education and your capital, and you have more opportunities to experiment with different varieties, and just to be able to afford um, losing some experiments. Not everybody can do that, but it would be great to find a way to, yeah, to give equal opportunities of winning in sort of a competition like this. So I see that Regine agrees with the concept, so maybe we can try to think from here.
Well, you and I have been talking about this idea for a little while, and
Yeah.
you know that, I mean, I love the idea also because I would really like to see more gender equity in competitions. I think that, you know, there's also a big challenge, again, as I've been teaching sustainability, I have students from all around the world, right? And I think it's sometimes a big challenge for competitors from a coffee producing country to be able to have, you know, there's not always necessarily the same level of even training and educational opportunities, even within the competitions. So I think, you know, there's a lot to consider when we talk about, you know, both equality and equity, I would say, you know, for the competitions. But of course, there's so much fun. But, you know, I know some other people are thinking about how sustainable are they as well, just as events and in terms of all the waste, say, of the milk or the water or whatnot. So hopefully in the 21st century, you know, we see some progress being made in these areas so we can keep what is really wonderful and celebratory about the competitions, but maybe adjust them so the structures can be more equitable.
Do you wanna have a role in coffee in the future, in a close future, or the longer term? What is your plan with once you're done with your research?
So my plan is that, well, I can't imagine not being in coffee in some way, of course, you know. So I think it's just a question of, you know, if my writing and if my teaching can contribute some meaningful, especially for the gaps, you know, back to what I was saying before about like these, you know, different stories and histories and ideas that, you know, I didn't see before. So if I can continue to contribute in a way that's meaningful, then I will continue. But, you know, for me, it's, of course, I'll always support my friends in coffee, and I'll always be drinking coffee. So, but yeah, but I want my writing to, you know, amplify the voices, particularly of women in coffee around the world. And I want to, yes, amplify like the stories of, you know, the politics and the literature and the words. And so, you know, we can be a little in the same way like we have the lexicon for the flavor wheel. You know, I want us to think a little bit more about maybe a lexicon for these coffee words, right? The words that we've been talking about this whole conversation. So
Well, I can't wait
maybe
for these writings.
maybe could I end with a quote from a poet rather than a poem? Maybe I'll just quote this because I think it summarizes everything we've been talking about today about the power of words. And I hope the people who are listening to this, especially in the future, they've maybe heard of Dr. Maya Angelou, who actually died a few years ago. She was an African-American poet, and it was amazing. I got to hear her speak twice in, you know, before she died. I never met her though, but she had this really distinctive, beautiful way of, especially, you know, when she would give a speech or she would read a poem, of hers or of someone else. And there was one time when she was actually talking to Oprah in an interview, and she was talking about the power of words. And so now I'm quoting Dr. Maya Angelou, and she says, words are things. I think they get on the walls. They get in your wallpaper. They get in your rugs and your upholstery and your clothes, and finally into you. And what she was trying to get us to think about, that we need to be careful about the words that are used in our house or out of our house, right? Because the words that we use in our house, she was saying there, that it gets into us. And then we go out of the house, and then how we use words can be a weapon, right? Or words can be a gift and encouragement. So that's what I hope we will just all think more deeply about the words we're using.
Mind your words.
Yes, exactly.
Great.
So
on that note, I will remember to anyway, like since we met at least through Zoom, I kept thinking about this a lot. So thanks for that in general, and thanks also, of course, for being part of Rain or Shine, and for this wonderful time that I spent with you. And I'm sure the people who are going to listen to this conversation will get a lot from that, either on YouTube or podcasts. So thanks again.
Great. Thank you so much, Emmanuel. It was really nice to talk to you. And I'm really supporting Rain or Shine, and hope that you'll be able to continue even beyond COVID-19.
Yes, hopefully. I know you wanted to end this conversation with a song. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Sure. It's just, okay, so you were saying that you have a coffee playlist of songs, and I do also. And this is one that I really enjoy. So I thought it would kind of end this conversation in a nice note with the idea of the coffee shop and poetry and the conversation about words.
Perfect. All right. Let's enjoy Erika's song, everybody, and see you soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Gray, quiet and tired and mean, looking at a worried scene. Try to make you mad at me over the phone. Red eyes and fire sometimes, taken by a nursery rhyme. I wanna make a ray of sunshine and never leave home. No amount of coffee, no amount of crime, no amount of whiskey, no amount of wine. No, 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 no. Nothing else will do. I've gotta have you. I've gotta have you. Road gets cold. There's no spring in the middle this year. And I'm the new chicken clucking open hearts and ears. Oh, such a prima donna, sorry for myself. But green is also summer, and I won't be warm till I'm lying in your arms. No amount of coffee, no amount of crime, no amount of whiskey, no amount of wine. No, 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 no. Nothing else will do. I've gotta have you. I've gotta have you. I see it all through a telescope. got a suitcase and a warm curl, lying in the back of the blue road, humming a tune. No amount of coffee, no amount of crime, no amount of whiskey, no wine, no, 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 no. Nothing else will do. I've gotta have you. I've gotta have no amount of coffee, no amount of crime, no amount of whiskey, no amount of wine, no, 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 no. Nothing else will do. I've gotta have you. I've gotta have you. I've gotta have you. I've gotta have you. I've gotta have you.
It was the Whippies, Gotta Have You. Bye bye.